Greetings everybody! Here I am doing a recording on what may well be my final video of the year. I don't know if it will be, but I'm going to make it count just in case it is. I've said before both on and off of YouTube that The Prince of Egypt is one of my favorite movies of all time, not just animated. And in case you didn't know that the movie had its own stage musical, it does, or rather did. It opened on West End just 1 month before the lockdown happened, and then released a cast recording which I made a video on just shortly after its release. The show opened back up on West End once restrictions were lifted, but its run during that time was rather shaky, since it looked inevitable that the show was going to close down, which it ultimately did at the beginning of last year. The people behind it decided to preserve it in one very specific, special way, by making a pro shot recording of it. The pro shot version aired on British TV in 2022, and then this year, 25 years after the release of the animated film, it got a limited theatrical run on UK cinemas in October, and then became available worldwide through streaming on iTunes and Amazon Prime just this past month. And it's also available on DVD and Blu-ray on their website. And as you can see right here, I have it downloaded into my library. Now the sad thing is, with the musical having a considerably short life on West End, and the pandemic definitely being a primary reason for that, I don't know if it's planning to return to West End, or if it has any plans for future productions anywhere else in the world. Because, let's face it, The Prince of Egypt, despite its incredibly devoted fan base, isn't exactly the most marketable title out there. I mean, we all know that it's a sad reality that if it's not a huge merchandise juggernaut, then the studio isn't going to pay much attention to it, be it Disney or even something like DreamWorks. So I think we should count our blessings whenever they do, and adapting their properties into musicals, I feel, is one way that they do so. In some ways, I consider it a bit more dignified than saturating the toy market with it, particularly something like The Prince of Egypt. Even if this whole nostalgia tie-in thing is becoming infectious with the stage market just as it is the current film market. I would still hardly call this stage rendition an insult to the animated movie, what with the scope and budget. Even if the additions, expansions, or new renditions don't quite work for you, you can't say that the people in this one just didn't care whatsoever, because you can definitely tell that there was a lot of love put into this. And I don't think that they were even doing this simply for the sake of nostalgia bait either. Yes, the name recognition does play some part in attracting audiences' attentions, and it does feature songs and the story beats that you can come to expect. However, there is just enough here for the musical to carve out its own identity. I mean, I may just be speaking for myself, and it is possible that I'm only saying this because I've been listening to the cast recordings enough times that I was namely following that while watching the show. But I can confidently say that by the time I was well into the second act, I had almost forgotten that I was watching an adaptation of one of my favorite animated movies, and I just saw myself as watching another iteration of the Exodus story. Though part of that could be that I've only watched the show twice thus far, and I could be just speaking here fresh off the hype. But I will say that after what felt like a very down year for me, this was perhaps the best Christmas gift that I could get thus far. Now, I've been listening to the cast recording for 3 years already, and my overall impression when I made my video on it was that I thought it was rather engaging. Not perfect, but whenever it fell short of anything, there was always something else that made up for it. Now, having purchased the recording on my iTunes library and having watched it twice, watching the show helped me to fill in some of the gaps in the cast recording, more than I was initially expecting it would be, so I'm here to give my full thoughts in it, in scripted but unedited form like I did earlier for the Hercules stage musical. The first thing I will say is that I think the show does a spectacular job of integrating all elements of the stage. The dancers, the props, the practical effects, the lighting and screen projections, trapdoors and tilting platforms, all combined very effectively without relying too heavily on any single one. I've heard great things about it before, but after seeing it for myself, I'd say it's some of the best examples I've ever seen from a stage show. Dancers imitate movements of the flow of the Nile to sand in a windstorm, and they even merge together with a combination of lighting to symbolize God as the burning bush, or even as chariots for Moses and Ramses early in the show. Dancers even pose as pillars in a temple at points, or even as the stone part of a well, and I buy it. Very effective use. The stage has only a few fake bricks that are used for, well, the opening with the Hebrew slaves, obviously, but they are also used in later scenes to assemble into the Pharaoh's throne, and even the royal barge sailing on the Nile. Maybe one of the best uses of minimal props and actors is during the death of the firstborn, where mothers are carrying these little white cloths that signify a bundle of a baby, only to unveil the empty cloths and then place them over stones to signify graves. That's almost as eerie as the angel of death in the film. I think the two moments where all elements are utilized at once most effectively are the plague song and the parting of the Red Sea. Probably the most optimal moments to pull out all the stops, to be honest. When it comes to costumes, on the other hand, I know that there are plenty of people who didn't like costume designs, and I've read a number of comments about that. I mean, the Hebrew and Midian costumes look more or less like what you'd probably expect, but for the Egyptians, I guess you could say they look more like something out of Vegas. Like they're dressed up in these white linen pants and coats, not just loincloths, almost like 70s, 80s disco interpretations of Egyptian attire. Even the royal crowns in the movie don't look exactly like what you'd expect. There are two traditional crowns that people would typically think of when it comes to Egyptian royalty. The pharaoh's tall, cylindrical double crown is called chent, very difficult to pronounce, and the other is nemes, a linen headcloth that both Ramses and Seti wear in the animated movie. But both Ramses and Seti's and even Queen Tuya's and Nefertari's crowns in the movie look more like gold crowns that you'd wear from medieval Europe, just with some slightly different shapes. Maybe if I did some more digging into the musical, I could find out the thought process behind these costume designs, but my first guess is that actual Egyptian clothing, like we've come to expect, for as light as it is, might be a bit cold for all performers to adapt to in the cooler English climate. Something else worth mentioning that I can see some taking issue with is that the stage show does have more quips and one-liners than the animated movie. Not that I think that the humor is that out of place or at odds with the rest of the tone of the story, but with how seriously the animated film took itself and how much it's praised for that, the comic bits are generally agreed by audiences to be the film's weakest points. But I do in a way kind of respect the musical for not being so heavy-handed with taking itself so seriously throughout, just because the audiences love the animated movie for being serious. It does feel like the musical does want to be its own thing and to really establish its own identity, and I can respect it for that, even with the abundance of one-liners it tosses about here and there. Besides, it certainly doesn't tone down the darker, heavier subject matter. Right in the opening, during the visual representation of the mass genocide of newborn Hebrews, we see this represented with a soldier straight up tearing out a baby's innards. Yes, really. And some of the performances here in the show were just so authentic that they even brought tears to my eyes. Like Luke Brady as Moses. The way he breaks down after he's discovering that he's Hebrew and doesn't have a drop of royal blood in him, and then flees into the desert, up to him looking around at the graves of all the deceased firstborns to his number for the rest of my life, which is this musical's equivalent to Gethsemane from Jesus Christ Superstar. And it gets even more intense when Moses is crying out to God in frustration, "Why are you inflicting all this suffering onto those who don't deserve it?" And God's response is Seti's very words, "Sacrifices must be made for the greater good." As far as characterizations go, Moses is more or less the same to how he is in the movie, starting out as a carefree prince before he's hit with reality and becomes humble and somber in his role as a deliverer for his people. And the most notable difference is the inclusion of his I Want song, where he hopes that maybe he'll leave his mark somewhere in history. His wife Zipporah is just as fiery and free-spirited as her movie counterpart, and his brother Aaron is just as cynical and as critical of him during his first attempt to free the Hebrews. But for the other characters in the show and how they diverge, let's start off with Ramses. Liam Tomney plays him more as socially awkward and dorky compared to his film counterpart. Namely, he's conflicted with his own self-identity, but you can really tell that he's struggling with the weight of the entire kingdom and all the expectations on his shoulders. even has points where he acknowledges that being Pharaoh, in fact, doesn't give him the freedom that he once thought it would. So I honestly think that it works, his characterization. His dynamic with Moses feels just as wholesome and brotherly as in the movie, but they've got plenty of similar bonding moments showing that they care for one another, but it also throws in a moment of them squabbling and roughhousing, even when both of them are princesses, even before their showdown as Pharaoh versus Deliverer. It does make the relationship feel more well-rounded, and it makes it just as heart-wrenching during everything that tests their bond before what happens in the end, which, full disclosure, has a very different ending from the animated movie and the standard telling of the Exodus story, which I will explain more about later. Okay, Pharaoh Seti is a lot more ruthless and uproarious as both a father and ruler in this version. Not just the way he chastises Ramses for being the weak link, but when Moses flees into the desert, he eventually just calls off the search for him and proclaims him banished for murder. Even when dying from heartbreak shortly after, for that proclamation, he's shown having hardened his heart so much that he puts Egypt above even those he loves, saying that as Pharaoh, Egypt is his first and his last born. Not exactly out of league for a man who is willing to declare mass genocide on newborn Hebrews, but when Ramses adopts this philosophy, it really comes back to bite him, particularly as he uses it as a response when Moses begs him to think of his own son who would be a direct victim of the plagues. Queen Tuya, Moses' adopted mother, she's characterized similarly to her film version as a loving, caring mother and a devoted wife and queen, but is given a bit more of an expanded role to suit the longer running time of the musical. When she draws Moses out of the river, knowing full well that he's a Hebrew, she says that he was so beautiful that she considered him a blessing in her life when she wasn't allowed to have any more children after Ramses, something that wasn't mentioned in the movie, but is a welcome addition, I think. It makes it all the more tragic to watch her over the course of the show when she loses both Moses and Seti, and especially later when Moses is inflicting the plagues upon Egypt, in which she is still present in the story, I should just add right there. But the musical's version of Miriam, Moses' sister, is an especially tragic case. As opposed to the optimist and nurturing sister figure she is in the movie, the show paints her as a desperate and emotionally racked woman holding on to the brink of her sanity after all these years as a slave, praying for Moses to be her deliverer while everyone else believes she has gone mad for it. But in the end, she's declared as having the gift of prophecy. Now, onto some other characters. This rendition of the story also features two new additions to the cast, or rather one semi-new addition in the form of Hotep, the high priest. Instead of being one of the comic duo that the movie had, he has a prominent role as a voice of influence for the decisions made by Ramses and the royal family, with him being an actual high priest as opposed to just a court magician. The other addition to the cast who happens to also be a major voice of influence for Ramses and his decisions is Queen Nefertari. I knew from listening to the cast recording where she has her own song Heartless, a song which she's mourning the loss of her son in the shambles of Egypt's dynasty. I knew that she would have a role, but after seeing the facade that she puts on throughout the show, it hits even harder, especially because she was a major source of Ramses' hubris and his refusal to heed Moses' words. She and Ramses are engaged to unite the kingdom early on in the first act, and she's clearly a princess with a heart of stone who abides by the philosophy of married for duty, not for love. But the last that she's seen in the show during her number Heartless really does prove that there is a heavy price to pay for her way of thinking, perhaps even heavier when she ultimately had to admit that she was still human with human thoughts and human emotions. And on to the subject of the songs, they are repurposed from the animated film in some cases as well. I had mentioned some of the alterations when I talked about the cast recording, like how the plague song during the showdown between Moses and Ramses, instead of reprising All I Ever Wanted like the animated movie, reprises one of the show's original songs, Make It Right. But the repurposing also extends to alterations in the point of the story and the development between the characters, like Through Heaven's Eyes. Whereas in the movie it was a montage of Moses starting a new life in Midian, Here it's relegated to being a dance number for the welcome celebration with Jethro, as Moses gradually starts to feel more accepted and welcome. And that is a and I think that that's a welcome change, largely because of how the relationship between Moses and Zipporah starts out and the way it progresses throughout the story. See, when Zipporah escapes Egypt for the first time, it isn't because Moses lets her slip away like he did in the animated movie. In fact, he confronts her during her escape, accusing her of being ungrateful and saying that she should feel honored to serve in the house of royalty instead of wandering about in the desert looking for food and shelter. And she retorts, "In my land, we say that if you don't choose your own path, you're lost no matter where you go." And because of this, Zipporah initially is against the idea of welcoming Moses in with the people of Midian, which does make sense in this context. She only just starts to warm up to him over the course of the song, through Heaven's Eyes, but she really only falls in love with him during the following song, Never in a Million Years. I'm not saying that I prefer her development here to the animated movie. I'm just saying that both cases work in their own respective story beats, I think. There's no playing with the big boys because the big reason for that is because the scene of Moses demonstrating God's power by turning the staff into a snake and the priests doing the same thing is omitted from this telling of the Exodus story. Just a quick little snippet of Hotep demonstrating a trick by turning a stick into a snake early in the first act. The reason for this removal is because of the dynamic between Moses and Ramses, I think. At this point in the story, they both make it clear to one another that they at least are making the effort to understand each other's duties that they are trying to live up to, and they don't want to throw away their brotherhood. So instead of having priests trying to one-up the power of God, the show cuts to the quick of Moses trying to persuade Ramses to release the Hebrews, trying to say, imagine you were in my place. Imagine you were born into the world. Imagine that you were born into poverty and then just adopted into the house of royalty, only to find that out years later that everything you knew just wasn't so. While Ramses' logic is, having all this power doesn't mean I can just do away with all these presidents, with all these traditions. I do still have my duty to my people. And this is where the song On Your Side comes into play, where they both make compromises that, okay, Ramses will set the Hebrews free as long as Moses stays behind in Egypt to serve him as the brother he used to be. No. Actually, in fact, Ramses' motivations are largely different in this telling, and that could be for a variety of factors. But most of his decisions that end up costing him do come from a combination of influence from Seti, Hotep, and Nefertari. Not only with Egypt as his first and last born, but they also reprimand him for trying to compromise with Moses, saying, Pharaoh doesn't make compromises. Nope, Pharaoh doesn't make promises. And even seeming to be behind the reason for him turning against Moses, because he believed that Moses was the one who abandoned him and the family when he fled into the desert. Now, just by listening to the cast recording, it's easy to tell that Ramesses has a change of heart by the end. But watching the whole show does fill in some of the gaps regarding his influence of his decisions. After Moses sends the Hebrews through the Red Sea, he stays behind and offers himself up to Ramses to kill, to imprison, to enslave, whatever, as the ransom for all the damage that he's inflicted upon Egypt. And this is where Ramses' decisions takes a whole different turn, where rather than giving in to defeat and losing everything, he salvages what he has left of his brotherhood with Moses, which also in turn means letting him go to be free with his people. And Ramesses decides to be the weak link that breaks the chain of destruction forged by Egyptian fathers and forefathers, concurring that there is a way of honoring the past without being bound to it. That I can admire. I think it's a satisfying, bittersweet note to end the story on for both sides, however much it diverges from most other tellings of the Exodus story. So yeah, I think that this show has a lot going for it. And I really think that it is a show that deserves whatever attention and support it can get. It's available to buy or rent on iTunes and Apple TV, and is available for pre-order on DVD and Blu-ray, as I mentioned, on the musical's website. And even for all of whatever shortcomings it has, I firmly believe that it is worth your time. Even if it can't take the place of the animated feature in your art, because, well, I don't think that you should really be expecting it to do that anyways. Just give it a chance for what it does have to offer and draw your own conclusions. That would be my advice. But in any case, I Look forward to hearing whatever you have to say. Whether this be my last video of the year or not, I will be keeping in touch with you well into next year, so take care.